So we just got our first developer live stream for Season 8 of Diablo 4, and I have to say, this is pretty much a long list of changes that I wanted for the game. In fact, I did a video a couple weeks ago now where I laid out generally what I wanted for the future of the game, especially going into Season 8, and a lot of the things I wanted were things that are now being changed going into Season 8, and on top of that, there's a ton of new content coming with Season 8 as well, with a very big focus on boss, which is also something I wanted the developers to do a big pass on to give us much more difficult and interesting bosses to face. And it seems like that is also the theme of Season 8 outside of all of these other game-wide changes. Now in this video, I primarily want to go over some of these more base game changes, but I will be doing a bunch of future videos going over all of the other specifics coming to Season 8 because there's actually a ton of stuff. Now for the base changes coming to the game going into Season 8, the overall theme is making the game more difficult and making it have a longer tail once you get into the end game. And this is what I went over in my previous videos, that I want the game to be more difficult. Season 7 was way too fast and way too easy. There was basically no chase for any item in the game. If you were even somewhat efficient while leveling up, you could get to level 60 in only a handful of hours. I think the average player took 9 hours. So that's also including the slowest players of the game, and everything was just way too fast. But it looks like they're changing quite a lot of that. Now, one of the first things they're doing that I also think was a major issue for the game is they're not doing these big mid-season updates anymore like we were getting before. We would basically get halfway through a season and then they would do a decent update balancing a bunch of stuff. Now, instead of that mid-season update, they're just going to be very reactive when the season first starts, and in the first couple weeks, they're going to be constantly balancing stuff. And I think this is much better than what they've been doing with the mid-season updates. I think balancing in Diablo 4 has actually been a massive downside for the game when specifically talking about the massive outliers, because every season we've had a couple builds or even just a couple classes be so absurdly OP that nothing in the game is even difficult whatsoever, and everything, even like 150 pets, are pretty trivial for that build. And this also compounds the issue once you get into any open world stuff, because that randomly puts you with other players, especially for Season 7, where most of the new content was in the open world, and you would go to do this new open world content, you would summon the new boss, and it would die before its health bar even popped up because there was a blood wave necro there. That just massively hindered a lot of the gameplay of the game. Even though I really enjoyed Season 7 just because of the base combat of the classes, it was really boring going into the witch tides and having any of the bosses or any of the enemies be basically insta-killed anytime there was another player around, because they'd be snapshot and cataclysm as a druid or a blood wave necro and just insta-kill everything. So they're trying to be much more reactive early on to nerf anything that's incredibly strong. They specifically said if they're going to be nerfing something, they are not going to put it in like a lower tier, like going S to A. They would normally just be nerfing things that are like S plus and putting them down to S, so they're not absolutely one-shotting everything. And then they also want to very early on bring up really weak builds to try to give a lot more build to play. Now, for whatever reason, I've heard a bunch of people try to say that this means they're doing a lot less work in each season to work on the expansion or something. That's absolutely not what's going on here, especially with how they explained it. They're basically just moving pretty much all of the balancing work of the entirety of a season into the first couple weeks. They want to balance all the outliers really quickly, so then after that point, you don't have to worry about a bunch of changes coming into the mid-season, and then they could fix stuff that could be a massive hindrance to the game in general. And another big area of change is the speed of leveling up to level 60. And they actually gave us some specific numbers going from Season 6 to Season 7. In Season 6, it took the average player 15 to 17 hours to get to max level. So that would be the average. So this also includes all the best players and all of the worst players. So 15 to 17 hours to get to max level and get into your Paragon board. But then going into Season 7, that went down to an average of 9 hours. On average, it took around half the time to get to max level. It was way too fast. And again, if you're a player that's more efficient, if you've been watching my channel, watching build videos or looking up any other guides, you're probably significantly more efficient than that 9 hours. It probably only took you a handful of hours to get to level 60. There's basically zero progression in that. And in a game like this and other ARPGs, the progression of going from level 1, getting to max level, and continuing to gear up is the entirety of the game. That's what the game is completely based around. So having basically no time from going 1 to max level was really bad in general. I'm glad they're changing this, and they're trying to adjust it back up to season 6 pace. So they're trying to get it to on average be around like 16 hours to get to level 60. And another piece that's going to heavily impact leveling up and gearing up while leveling up is the changes coming to gear, and more specifically the changes coming to gear before max level. This is also something I touched on in one of my previous videos. So it was super fast to level up, but you would get a legendary almost instantly, and then you wouldn't care about anything else besides legendaries. And they gave some more information on this as well. Players were getting a legendary every 3 to 4 minutes within your first hour of playing season 6. That means that there was basically no other tier of items in season 6. You would get a legendary and you would never not have another legendary on. You're never going to go from legendary and go back down to rares. And you were getting gear so quickly that you just constantly upgraded. Did not feel good, felt like there was zero progression, and it felt like legendaries weren't legendary, they were just the only tier or rarity of item. So they're making some big adjustments. Legendary drops during level up have been reduced. It sounds like they're going to be pretty heavily reduced. This is good. When you get a legendary while leveling up, that should feel really good. You should feel a power spike, but now they're making it so magic items can have up to 2 affixes. They won't always, but they can have up to 2 affixes, which would make them kind of twice as strong. Then rare items can now also have up to 3 affixes. So rare items are also going to be really strong if they have the 3 affixes on them, because again, this means rare items can have 2 to 3 affixes, so they're not always going to have the 3. And then once you get to max level, legendaries are still going to be the best quality of items. So we're not really going to be going back to like season 4 where you would be just picking up every rare item as well. When you get to level 60, you're still pretty much only going to be looking for legendaries or uniques or mythics. But while leveling up, you're actually going to be looking for other gear, and you're not just going to be getting legendary drops consistently. And then once we get into the end game, they're also pretty heavily increasing the difficulty of everything. Because of the new torment system, when we got the big difficulty overhaul, it's actually going to be more easy for them to do this, where they can just increase the difficulty of certain torment tiers to make the whole game more difficult. And they gave some more information on this as well. So for season 7, the overall progression speed and number of players reaching torment 4 had doubled. On average, it only took 15 hours from level 60 to hit torment 4. So that's the highest difficulty, and to get into it to be farming. So that's incredibly quick. So on average, a lot of people would be going from level 1 to 60 and going into torment 4 in a similar time previous seasons would take them just to get to level 60. And in season 7, 50% of players hit torment 4. Now they did not specify if this was 50% of characters or accounts. Presuming it's 50% of characters, which is probably worse because that would probably dilute the pool even more. And they actually want only around 10% of players to be hitting torment 4, because keep in mind, this is still a pretty casual game, and a lot of people who play normally aren't going to be hitting the highest difficulties early on. And keep in mind, with the torment system, sitting in torment 1 doesn't exclude you from any gear. You're just getting more gear going into torment 4. So the adjustments they're making to the end game is torment 1 will now start at pit level 10, and the torment and pit scaling is increased by 20%. And this is multiplicative scaling, so every torment level you go up and every pit level you go up will now be scaling 20% harder. So that's a lot more than just like a 20% difficulty increase overall. That's multiplicative, so it'll be a lot more difficult. And torment 4 will be the equivalent to season 7's pit tier 76. So pretty much everything in the game is going to be a lot more difficult, and that includes pits, which are generally scaled outside of torment levels now, but everything else is going to be more difficult in the torment tiers, specifically when going up to torment 4. So even if you're doing open world stuff, it'll be more difficult. If you're going and doing bosses, they will be a lot more difficult. And this is something I have very much been wanting, that the end game just felt way too easy. You would go into boss layers and very easily just one-shot every boss. You would be in the open world, deleting everything on your screen in singular hits, even if you really didn't have a full build yet. So everything is just way too easy, and I'm very glad they're massively increasing the difficulty. And like I mentioned, there's a ton of other stuff coming with Season 8. We're getting a massive overhaul to the entire layer boss system with a bunch of new layer bosses coming in. That's all permanent additions. We're getting the new boss rush activity as part of the season theme. We're getting the new boss powers as a season theme where we defeat bosses and take their powers and can add other augments to those powers to kind of craft our own boss abilities. So there's a ton of new content coming, but that's pretty much all the main changes to the base difficulty and pacing of the game going into Season 8, and I couldn't be happier with this. Like I mentioned in one of my previous videos, this is a pretty long list of a lot of the things I wanted. Season 7 was way too easy, and I'm glad that they are actually putting in a bunch of work to change that and try to revert it back to earlier seasons that had more chase, and the entirety of the progression of level 1 all the way to end Paragon levels is going to just be a lot more satisfying. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.